The audition room was small, windowless, and overly bright, the kind of space designed to keep people nervous. A single table sat in the center with 3 white casting directors behind it, laptops open, coffee cups half empty. On the wall, a printed sign read, "Please prepare your material and be ready." Evan Morales stood just inside the doorway, holding his script in both hands. He was a deaf actor in his late 20s, tall, lean, with expressive eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room at once. A small hearing device rested behind his ear, visible but unobtrusive. He had arrived early, as he always did, carefully reviewing the scene in his mind, not how it sounded, but how it felt. Evan communicated primarily through American Sign Language, though he could read lips well enough to navigate rooms like this one. He had learned long ago that the world rarely slowed down for people like him. The casting assistant glanced up briefly. "Name?" she asked. "Evan Morales," he said clearly, his voice slightly textured but steady. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then scribbled something on her clipboard. "Okay, go ahead." Evan stepped forward and took his mark. Before he could begin, the casting director in the center leaned forward. "Just to be clear," the man said, speaking louder than necessary, "this role has dialogue, a lot of it." Evan nodded. "I know," he replied calmly. The woman to the man's left exchanged a look with the other director. "And how exactly do you plan to handle that?" she asked. Evan lifted his hands gently. "Through performance," he said. "Through movement, expression, timing." The man sighed, already glancing at his laptop. "Why don't you just try the first page?" he said. "Let's see." Evan began. The room changed. His hands moved with controlled intensity, every gesture precise, every pause intentional. His face carried emotion so clearly it felt impossible to look away. Fear, hope, grief, resolve, layered seamlessly. He wasn't signing the words so much as embodying them, translating the soul of the scene into something visual and immediate. For 30 seconds, no one interrupted. Then the woman raised her hand. "Okay, that's interesting," she said carefully. "But this is a speaking role." Evan lowered his hands slowly. "I can speak," he said, "but the character doesn't need to sound powerful to be powerful." The man in the center smiled thinly. "We're looking for someone more traditional." Another added, "Audiences expect a certain realism." Evan nodded again. He was used to that word, realism, being used as a gate. "So," the first man said, already typing, "we're going to pass." Just like that. No feedback, no discussion, no curiosity. Evan thanked them anyway. He always did. Outside the building, the city noise moved around him like a distant storm. Horns, voices, footsteps he felt more than heard. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, shoulders relaxed, breathing evenly. Rejection didn't shock him anymore. What stayed with him wasn't the word no. It was the certainty with which it was delivered, as if his ability had been measured before he ever stepped into the room. That evening, back in his small apartment, Evan set up his phone on a tripod. The walls were bare, the lighting imperfect. He didn't plan a speech. He didn't explain himself. He performed the scene again. Fully, honestly, without permission. And when he pressed upload, he had no idea that within days, the very performance deemed unrealistic would be seen, shared, and celebrated by millions of people around the world, forcing the industry that dismissed him to finally see what it had refused to imagine. Evan Morales did not check the video after uploading it. He washed his hands, made tea, and sat by the window of his small apartment as the city lights flickered on one by one. For him, the performance had already served its purpose. It was proof, not to the casting directors, not to the industry, but to himself, that his voice did not need permission to exist. He went to sleep early. By morning, his phone was vibrating. At first, Evan assumed it was a technical glitch, a missed alarm, or an app error. But when he opened his notifications, the screen flooded with movement. Messages stacked on top of one another faster than he could read them. Likes, shares, comments. The video had been reposted overnight by a small deaf creator's account. From there, it spread outward to acting communities, accessibility advocates, film students, and then far beyond any group Evan had ever imagined reaching. People didn't talk about his hearing loss. They talked about his presence. His eyes tell the whole story. I forgot he wasn't speaking. This is what acting actually is. Evan watched the video again, this time through the reactions of strangers. He saw what they saw, not limitation, but intention, not absence, but precision. By noon, the numbers had climbed into the hundreds of thousands. By evening, into the millions. News outlets began reaching out, first through email, then through direct messages, then through interpreters offering to help coordinate interviews. A film professor tweeted a clip of the performance with a single sentence. This is why the industry confuses familiarity with talent. Across town, in the same casting office where Evan had been dismissed, someone noticed. An assistant opened her phone during lunch and froze. "Isn't this the guy from yesterday?" she asked quietly. The casting director leaned over, irritation already on his face, until he saw the video. He watched in silence. No laptop, no notes, no interruptions. The room felt smaller. Meanwhile, Evans sat at his kitchen table with an interpreter on video call, trying to process what was happening. He answered questions slowly, thoughtfully, refusing to frame his story as inspiration or tragedy. "I didn't go viral because I'm deaf," he signed calmly during one interview. "I went viral because I told the truth with my body." That sentence travelled almost as far as the video. Actors, famous ones, began sharing it. Directors commented publicly, admitting they had never considered performance beyond spoken dialogue. Schools requested permission to use the clip in classes. Evan's inbox filled with opportunities, not auditions, but conversations. For the first time, people asked how he worked instead of whether he could. Late that night, as the city quieted again, Evan sat alone on his couch, phone finally still. He felt no rush of victory, no urge to prove anyone wrong, only clarity. The room that rejected him had been small. The world that saw him was not. And somewhere between those two spaces, something fundamental had shifted, not just for him, but for every performer who had ever been told that their way of expressing truth was unrealistic. The industry had passed on Evan Morales. The audience had not. The offers did not arrive all at once. They came carefully at first, as if the industry needed time to convince itself that what it was seeing was real. A small independent director reached out, asking if Evan would consider a screen test, not an audition, a screen test, designed around physical storytelling rather than spoken dialogue. A theatre company followed, proposing a modern adaptation where silence was central, not accommodated. Then a major streaming platform requested a meeting. Evan read every message slowly, with an interpreter beside him, making sure nothing was misunderstood. He asked questions others found surprising. Will I be expected to speak if the scene doesn't require it? Who controls how my deafness is portrayed? Is this role written for me or adjusted around me? Some conversations ended quickly, others deepened. Meanwhile, the original casting office could no longer stay quiet. The video had passed 50 million views. Industry blogs named Evan Morales as the actor Hollywood didn't know it needed. Acting schools dissected his performance frame by frame. Critics used words like revolutionary and pure, words that had never appeared on his audition feedback forms. One afternoon, Evan received an email with a familiar logo at the top, the same casting company. The message was polite, professional, almost warm. They praised his unique presence and said they would love to reopen the conversation about future opportunities. No mention of the rejection. No acknowledgement of what had been said in that room. Evans stared at the screen for a long time. Then he replied with one sentence. "I was already ready when you weren't." He didn't send it. He closed the draft. Not every truth needed to be delivered directly. Instead, Evan accepted a meeting with the streaming platform. The room was larger than the audition space, the table wider, the faces more careful. Interpreters were present without being asked for. No one questioned whether dialogue was possible. They asked about emotion, rhythm, story. One executive leaned forward. "When you performed that scene," she said, "you made people feel heard without sound." Evans signed calmly. "Silence is not empty," he replied. "It's just unfamiliar." The deal that followed was not framed as a miracle, it was framed as inevitable. Weeks later, the original casting director watched Evans' name appear in headlines, not attached to activism, not reduced to disability, but listed plainly as lead actor. The director recognized the face immediately. The hands, the eyes, the stillness he had cut off after 30 seconds. In that moment, the realization came too late to matter, because the power had shifted permanently. Evan Morales had not forced his way into the industry. He had gone around it, and come back with the audience already on his side. And as cameras rolled on his first major project, Evans stood on set surrounded by people who listened when he spoke, or signed, knowing that the role he now played was bigger than any script. He wasn't proving that deaf actors could succeed, he was proving that the industry had been deaf to talent all along. The premiere was held in a theatre far larger than any room Evan Morales had ever auditioned in. Soft lights lined the walls. Interpreters stood naturally among the guests, not as an afterthought, but as part of the space itself. The audience filled every seat, critics, filmmakers, actors, students, all waiting in the low hum of anticipation that came before something unfamiliar and important. Evans sat in the middle row, hands resting calmly in his lap. He wasn't nervous. He had already survived the hardest part, being unseen. When the film began, the theatre went quiet in a way that felt different from silence. It wasn't emptiness, it was attention. On screen, Evan moved through the story with the same precision he had brought to that small audition room, every glance intentional, every pause alive with meaning. There were moments without dialogue that stretched just long enough to make the audience lean forward. Moments where no words could have improved what was being communicated. People forgot to breathe. When the final scene ended, there was a pause, a fraction of a second where no one moved. Then the applause came, not explosive, not performative, sustained. Evan stood slowly as the lights came up. He didn't bow, he didn't wave. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the room as an equal, not a guest asking to be welcomed. The reviews the next morning were unanimous. They didn't describe him as a deaf actor. They described him as an actor. Words like restraint, truth, and clarity appeared again and again. One critic wrote that Evans' performance reminded audiences that cinema was visual before it was verbal. Back at the casting office that had rejected him, the atmosphere was different now. New posters hung on the walls, ones about inclusion and accessibility. Interpreters were listed on call sheets. The same casting director watched interviews where Evans spoke, calmly, confidently, about process, not prejudice. He never mentioned the audition. He didn't need to. Evan returned to that city weeks later for a workshop with young performers, many of them deaf, many of them used to being told to adapt themselves to fit narrow definitions of realism. He stood in front of them and signed simply, "Don't wait for permission to be understood." They watched him with the same focus audiences had learned to give. That night, alone again in his apartment, larger now, brighter, but still quiet, Evans scrolled past the original video that had started everything. The comments were still coming in from all over the world. He didn't delete it. It wasn't a symbol of rejection anymore. It was evidence. Evidence that talent doesn't disappear when it's ignored. That silence can be expressive, that the world eventually listens, even if it takes millions of voices to correct one small room. Evan set his phone down and turned off the light. Tomorrow he would go back to work. Not as an exception, not as a statement, but as what he had always been, a performer whose truth had finally been allowed to exist at full volume without ever needing to make a sound.